In the sprawling desert city of Reno, Nevada, where the Sierra Nevada mountains cast their shadows over endless subdivisions of modern homes, 70-year-old Victoria Sterling had built what she thought was an unshakable legacy. As the founder and CEO of Sterling Logistics, one of the Southwest's most successful freight companies, she had spent 4 decades transforming a single truck into a multi-million-dollar empire that employed over 300 people across 5 states. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Victoria wasn't your typical grandmother. Her platinum hair was always professionally styled, her business suits tailored to perfection, and her office on the 20th floor of the Sterling Tower downtown commanded a view that stretched from Lake Tahoe to the Carson Valley. She had earned every dollar through 18-hour days, calculated risks, and an unwavering determination to provide her family with opportunities she had never had growing up in a trailer park on the outskirts of town. But on this particular March morning, as she stood outside the wrought iron gates of her son Bradley's mansion in the exclusive Collin Ranch neighborhood, Victoria was about to discover that success and sacrifice meant nothing when family loyalty crumbled. The mansion before her represented everything she had worked to achieve. She had purchased it 5 years earlier as a gift for Bradley and his wife Stephanie when their logistics consulting firm faced bankruptcy. The Spanish colonial architecture, with its red tile roof and perfectly manicured gardens, sat on 2 acres of prime real estate overlooking the Truckee River. The property was worth nearly $4 million, and Victoria's name remained on the deed as both a legal protection and a symbol of her continued investment in her son's future. Today was her 70th birthday, and the family gathering she had been anticipating for weeks was clearly already underway. Through the ornate metal bars of the gate, she could see cars filling the circular driveway. Her daughter Caroline's silver Mercedes, her son-in-law Robert's Tesla, and several vehicles she recognized as belonging to extended family members and close friends. The celebration she had helped plan, funded, and looked forward to was happening without her. Victoria checked her Rolex, a gift to herself on her 60th birthday when Sterling Logistics had reached its first $100 million revenue year. 3 o'clock exactly, the time specified in Bradley's invitation text from 2 weeks ago. She pressed the intercom button beside the gate, the familiar electronic chime echoing across the courtyard beyond. Silence. She tried again, holding the button longer this time. Through the tall windows of the house, she could see movement, shadows passing back and forth in what she knew was the grand living room, where family gatherings always centered around the massive stone fireplace. The sound of laughter drifted across the desert air, punctuated by the higher voices of her 3 grandchildren. Victoria pulled out her phone and tried calling Bradley directly. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. "You've reached Bradley Sterling. I'm either on another call or away from my phone. Leave a detailed message and I'll return your call as soon as possible." The formal businesslike greeting felt cold, impersonal. This was her son, the boy she had raised as a single mother after her husband David's fatal heart attack when Bradley was only 8 years old. The same son who had called her every Sunday without fail for 20 years, who had sought her advice on every major life decision, who had tearfully thanked her just last Christmas for everything she had sacrificed to build their family's security. "Bradley, it's Mom," she said after the beep, keeping her voice steady despite the growing knot of confusion in her stomach. "I'm outside the gate for the birthday party. The intercom doesn't seem to be working. Or maybe you can't hear it from inside. Could you buzz me in? I can see everyone's cars in the driveway." She ended the call and waited, expecting to hear the electronic buzz that would unlock the gate. Instead, she watched through the bars as a figure moved past the front windows. Someone tall enough to be Bradley himself, close enough to hear a phone ringing if he had chosen to answer it. The desert wind picked up, rustling the carefully maintained palm trees that lined the driveway. Victoria pulled her silk blazer tighter around her shoulders and checked her phone again. No return call, no text message explanation, just the growing realization that whatever was happening here was deliberate. She walked along the perimeter of the property, her heels clicking against the sidewalk that she had helped fund when the neighborhood was first developed. At the side gate that led to the backyard, she could hear more clearly now the sound of conversation, children playing, the distinctive clink of glasses that suggested a toast was being made. Her birthday celebration was in full swing, and she was standing outside like an uninvited stranger. Victoria had faced many challenges in building her business empire. She had negotiated with hostile competitors, navigated economic downturns, and made decisions that affected hundreds of employees and their families. But standing locked out of her own son's house on her 70th birthday, listening to her family celebrate without her, was unlike anything she had experienced in 7 decades of life. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest that it might be Bradley with an explanation. An apology, some reasonable justification for what was happening. Instead, the message was from Caroline. Running late to Bradley's. Traffic on 3095 is terrible. Save me some of Mom's favorite chocolate cake if she brought it. The text confirmed what Victoria already suspected, but had been reluctant to accept. Caroline didn't know her mother was standing outside, locked out, and uninvited. Whatever was happening here, her daughter wasn't part of the plan. Victoria walked back to the main gate and tried the intercom one more time. This time, instead of silence, she heard a click, followed by Bradley's voice, distorted slightly by the speaker but unmistakably her son. "Mom, we need to talk." The words hung in the desert air between them. Not happy birthday. Not come in. Not even I'm sorry about the confusion. Just those 5 words that carried the weight of something irreversible. "Bradley. What's going on? Why am I standing outside your house on my birthday while everyone else is inside celebrating?" There was a long pause before he responded. "It's complicated. Can we talk privately? Maybe you could come back later after everyone leaves." The suggestion hit Victoria like a physical blow. Come back later? After her own birthday party was over, after the guests she had helped invite finished celebrating her 70th year without her presence. "Bradley, I don't understand what's happening here. This is my birthday party. You sent me an invitation. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. Why would I need to come back later?" Another pause, longer this time. In the background, she could hear what sounded like a woman's voice, though the words were indistinct through the intercom system. Victoria recognized the tone if not the words. Stephanie, her daughter-in-law, speaking with the particular edge that had become increasingly familiar over the past year. "Mom, there are some things we need to discuss about the business, about your plans for retirement. Stephanie thinks it would be better if we handled family matters separately from business matters." The explanation made no sense. Victoria had already begun the process of transitioning leadership of Sterling Logistics to Bradley. For the past 2 years, he had been taking on increasing responsibilities, learning the intricacies of operations, building relationships with key clients. The succession plan was carefully structured, legally documented, and designed to ensure the company's continued success under his leadership. "What does any of that have to do with my birthday party?" Victoria asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to hear the answer. "Stephanie's mother is here," Bradley said finally, his voice barely audible through the speaker. "Janet flew in from Phoenix to celebrate with us, and Stephanie thought it might be awkward having both mothers present, given the family dynamics." The words struck Victoria speechless. Janet Reeves, Stephanie's mother, was a real estate agent from Arizona, whom Victoria had met, perhaps 5 times in the 8 years since Bradley and Stephanie married. A pleasant enough woman, certainly, but hardly someone whose presence would justify excluding Victoria from her own birthday celebration. "Bradley," Victoria said carefully, "are you telling me that you've excluded me from my own 70th birthday party because your wife's mother is visiting?" The silence stretched so long that Victoria began to wonder if the intercom had malfunctioned. Finally, Bradley's voice returned, sounding strained and uncomfortable. "It's not that simple, Mom. There are other considerations. Business considerations. Stephanie and I have been talking about the future of the company, about leadership transitions, about what happens when you decide to fully retire." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. "What kind of business considerations require excluding me from a family celebration?" The kind that affects everyone's future, Bradley replied, and this time there was no mistaking the defensiveness in his voice. Stephanie has some concerns about the way things have been handled, about decisions that have been made without full family input. The conversation was taking a turn that Victoria hadn't anticipated, moving from a simple misunderstanding about party logistics to something that sounded dangerously like a challenge to her authority as both family matriarch and business leader. Bradley, I think we need to have this conversation face to face. Please open the gate. I don't think that's a good idea right now. Stephanie's pretty upset about some recent developments, and having you here while Janet is visiting would just create unnecessary tension. Victoria stared at the intercom speaker, trying to process what she was hearing. Her son, the beneficiary of her life's work, was refusing to let her into his house on her birthday because his wife was pretty upset about unspecified recent developments. What developments? She asked. Another pause. Another background conversation she couldn't quite make out. When Bradley spoke again, his voice carried a resolve that Victoria found both unfamiliar and deeply troubling. Your relationship with David Morrison. The name hit Victoria like a thunderbolt. David Morrison was a successful attorney, recently widowed, whom she had been seeing for the past 6 months. At 70 and 68 respectively, their relationship was hardly scandalous. But it represented Victoria's first serious romantic involvement since her husband's death, 38 years earlier. What about David? Victoria asked, though she was beginning to understand the shape of what was happening. Stephanie's concerned about what your relationship might mean for the family. For the business, she thinks bringing someone new into the family dynamic at this stage could complicate the succession planning. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The explanation was so absurd that Victoria almost laughed. David Morrison was a respected estate planning attorney who had actually been helpful in structuring the legal documents that would eventually transfer Sterling Logistics to Bradley. His presence in her life, if anything, had made the business transition smoother and more legally sound. Bradley. David Morrison is helping us with the legal aspects of the succession plan. His involvement has been nothing but beneficial for the family and the business. That's not how Stephanie sees it. She thinks he might be influencing your decisions, maybe even encouraging you to change your will or the business structure in ways that could affect our future. Victoria felt the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't about David Morrison's influence on her decision-making. This was about Stephanie's fear that Victoria's new relationship might somehow interfere with her expectations about inheritance, about the transfer of wealth that would eventually flow from Victoria to Bradley to their children. So, you've locked me out of my own birthday party because your wife is worried that my dating life might affect your inheritance. The bluntness of the question seemed to catch Bradley off guard. It's not about inheritance, Mom. It's about family stability. About making sure everyone's interests are protected as we move forward. Everyone except mine, apparently. Victoria stepped back from the intercom, looking up at the house that represented so much of what she had worked to achieve. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being excluded from a celebration in a home she owned, by a son whose entire future depended on the business empire she had built, because of concerns about protecting family interests that apparently didn't include her own. The sound of a car approaching made her turn. Caroline's silver Mercedes was pulling up to the curb, her daughter visible through the windshield with a confused expression as she took in the scene. Victoria standing outside the locked gate instead of inside enjoying her party. Caroline parked and stepped out, elegant in a navy dress that Victoria recognized as an early birthday gift she had given her last month. At 45, Caroline had inherited Victoria's sharp intelligence and strong features, along with her father's gentler temperament. As a successful pediatric surgeon, she had built her own impressive career while maintaining the close family relationships that Victoria had always treasured. Mom, what are you doing out here? Why aren't you inside? The simple questions, asked with genuine confusion and concern, nearly broke Victoria's carefully maintained composure. Here was proof that not everyone in the family was part of whatever was happening, that Caroline at least still expected normal family dynamics to apply. "I'm asking myself the same question," Victoria replied, accepting Caroline's embrace while glancing meaningfully at the intercom system. Caroline followed her gaze, understanding dawning in her expression. "They locked you out? On your birthday?" Before Victoria could respond, the intercom crackled to life again. "Caroline, is that you? Come on in. We're just getting started with the cake." Bradley's voice sounded artificially cheerful, as if nothing unusual was happening. Caroline stared at the speaker, then at her mother, then back at the gate that separated them from the celebration beyond. "Bradley," Caroline called toward the intercom. "Why is Mom standing out here?" "What's going on?" "It's complicated, Caroline. We're handling some family business matters. Mom understands." The dismissive tone in Bradley's voice seemed to galvanize Caroline in a way that Victoria's own distress hadn't. As the younger sibling, Caroline had always looked up to Bradley, but she had also inherited their father's sense of justice and fairness. "I don't understand," Caroline said firmly. "And I don't think Mom understands either. This is her birthday party, Bradley. Open the gate." "Caroline, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. There are some adult conversations that need to happen, and this isn't the right time or place." Caroline turned to Victoria, her expression shifting from confusion to anger. "Mom, what adult conversations? What's he talking about?" Victoria found herself in the strange position of having to explain her own exclusion from her own birthday party. "Apparently, Stephanie has concerns about my relationship with David Morrison and how it might affect the family business, so they've decided to celebrate my birthday without me." The explanation sounded even more absurd when spoken aloud. Caroline stared at her mother, then at the intercom, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger, and determination. "Bradley Sterling," Caroline called toward the speaker, using the full name address that had meant serious business when they were children. "You have exactly 30 seconds to open this gate and explain yourself, or I'm calling every single person in that house to tell them what you've done." The threat carried weight because Caroline still maintained close relationships with most of their extended family. As a respected surgeon, and the family member most trusted to stay out of business politics, her word would carry significant influence with aunts, uncle, and cousins who might not fully understand the complexities of corporate succession planning, but would certainly understand the basic wrong of excluding someone from their own birthday celebration. The gate buzzed and began to swing open. Victoria felt a mixture of gratitude toward Caroline and sadness that it had taken her daughter's intervention to gain access to her own son's house. As they walked up the circular driveway together, she could see faces appearing at windows, family members clearly confused by the drama unfolding outside. The front door opened before they reached it, and Bradley appeared, looking deeply uncomfortable in the expensive casual clothes that Stephanie preferred for family gatherings. At 43, he still retained the boyish features that had made him such an engaging child, but his expression now carried a hardness that Victoria found almost unrecognizable. "Mom, Caroline, please come in. But I need you both to understand that this isn't easy for anyone." Victoria stepped into the foyer of the house she had purchased, looking around at the family members who had gathered to celebrate her birthday: her sister Margaret with her husband Tom, Bradley's 3 children ranging in age from 8 to 15, several cousins who had driven from Sacramento and Las Vegas, and in the center of it all, Stephanie and an older woman Victoria recognized as Janet Reeves. The conversation that had been flowing freely went silent as Victoria entered, the kind of uncomfortable quiet that follows the arrival of someone whose presence creates tension. It was perhaps the most surreal moment of Victoria's 70 years, walking into her own birthday party as if she were an unwelcome intruder. Aunt Victoria, 8-year-old Emma, Bradley's youngest, broke the silence by running forward with the unconscious joy of childhood. "Happy birthday! We were waiting for you to blow out the candles." The simple, honest greeting from her granddaughter highlighted the absurdity of the adult complications that had led to this moment. Victoria knelt to Emma's level, accepting the fierce hug and fighting back tears at the child's complete lack of understanding about the family dynamics swirling around her. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'm sorry I'm late." Stephanie approached from across the room, her smile polished but not reaching her eyes. At 38, she was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of blonde perfection that came from expensive maintenance and careful attention to detail. She had been a pharmaceutical sales representative when she met Bradley, and her skills in managing difficult conversations and maintaining surface-level pleasantness were clearly on display now. "Victoria, happy birthday! I hope you understand why we thought it might be better to keep things simple today, given everything that's been happening." The greeting was masterful in its passivity, suggesting that everything that's been happening was somehow Victoria's responsibility rather than the result of Stephanie's own concerns and manipulations. Victoria recognized the technique from her own business dealings: acknowledge the problem without accepting responsibility, express concern while maintaining plausible innocence. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Stephanie. What exactly has been happening that would require keeping my birthday celebration simple?" Janet Reeves stepped forward, extending a hand with the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to managing real estate transactions and difficult clients. "Victoria, so nice to see you again. Stephanie has told me so much about the wonderful success you've built with your company." The redirection was skillful, moving the conversation away from the immediate tension toward safer ground. But Victoria had spent 4 decades reading people in business negotiations, and she could see the calculation behind Janet's friendly demeanor. Caroline, who had been observing this exchange with growing frustration, stepped forward. "Could someone please explain to me why my mother was standing outside the gate to her own birthday party?" The direct question cut through the polite maneuvering, forcing everyone in the room to confront the situation rather than dance around it. Bradley cleared his throat uncomfortably, glancing at Stephanie as if seeking permission or support. "Caroline, there are some family business matters that we've been trying to address. Mom's new relationship has raised some concerns about how decisions are being made, about whether outside influences might be affecting the succession planning for Sterling Logistics." Victoria felt the last pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't just about David Morrison or even about inheritance concerns. This was about control, about who would ultimately have the authority to make decisions about the company she had built from nothing. The birthday lockout hadn't been about avoiding awkwardness or managing family dynamics. It had been a test, a demonstration of power, a message about how family relationships would be structured going forward. And Victoria was just beginning to understand how drastically her role in her own family was about to change. The uncomfortable silence that followed Bradley's explanation stretched across the elegant living room like a fault line, dividing the family into those who understood what was really happening and those still trying to process the implications. Victoria's 70 years of experience had taught her to read rooms full of people, to identify allies and adversaries, to recognize when someone was about to reveal information they'd rather keep hidden. Stephanie moved first, her pharmaceutical sales training evident in the way she attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Why don't we all sit down and enjoy some cake? This is supposed to be a celebration, after all." But Caroline wasn't ready to let the moment pass. As a surgeon, she was accustomed to getting to the heart of problems quickly and directly. "No, I think we need to understand what's really going on here before we pretend everything is normal. Bradley, you said something about outside influences affecting succession planning. What specifically are you referring to?" Bradley shot another glance at Stephanie, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. It was a small gesture, but Victoria caught it, and the dynamic it revealed was deeply troubling. In her own marriage to David, decisions had been made through discussion and mutual respect. What she was witnessing between her son and daughter-in-law suggested a very different kind of partnership. "David Morrison has been encouraging Mom to restructure the business transition," Bradley said, his voice gaining confidence as he apparently received permission to continue. "He suggested changes to the succession plan that could potentially delay or complicate the transfer of leadership." Victoria stared at her son in genuine confusion. "Bradley, David hasn't suggested any such thing. He's been helping us ensure that the legal documentation is properly structured to protect everyone's interests, including yours." "That's not how we understand it," Stephanie interjected smoothly. "From what we've heard, Mr. Morrison has been advocating for a more gradual transition, one that would keep more control in your hands for a longer period. The accusation was so far from reality that Victoria wondered if they were talking about the same person. David Morrison's legal advice had consistently focused on creating a clean, efficient transfer of authority that would allow Bradley to assume full leadership while protecting Victoria's financial security. If anything, David had been more generous in structuring the transition than Victoria's previous attorneys had recommended. "Where exactly did you hear this?" Victoria asked. Janet Reeves stepped forward, her real estate agent's smile never wavering. Well, Stephanie mentioned that there had been some concerns raised by other family members about the pace of the transition. "Which family members?" Caroline demanded, her surgeon's instinct for precision coming to the forefront. The question hung in the air unanswered, and Victoria began to understand that she was dealing with something more complex than simple misunderstanding or miscommunication. The vague references to other family members and concerns that had been raised suggested a coordinated effort to justify decisions that had already been made. Bradley's eldest child, 15-year-old Marcus, had been standing near the kitchen doorway throughout this exchange, and Victoria noticed the uncomfortable expression on his face. As her oldest grandchild, Marcus had always been particularly close to her, often spending summer weeks at her downtown penthouse apartment and occasionally accompanying her to business meetings when she thought the experience might be educational. "Marcus," Victoria said gently, "why don't you and Emma and Tyler go play in the backyard while the adults finish talking?" "Actually," Stephanie said quickly, "I think the children should stay. This affects their future too, and they're old enough to understand family business matters." The intervention was revealing. In Victoria's experience, adults who insisted on having sensitive conversations in front of children were usually planning to use those children as emotional leverage or witnesses to their own version of events. "I disagree," Caroline said firmly. "Adult business discussions don't belong in front of children, especially not on their grandmother's birthday." Marcus looked between the adults, clearly sensing the tension but not fully understanding its source. "Grandma Victoria, are you and Dad having a fight?" The innocent question cut through all the adult posturing and manipulation. Victoria knelt down to Marcus's level, looking into eyes that reminded her so much of Bradley at that age. "Sometimes adults have disagreements about important things, Marcus. But that doesn't change how much I love you, or how proud I am of the young man you're becoming. But why were you outside the gate?" Dad said, "You were coming late, but your car was already here when we arrived." The 15-year-old's observation was uncomfortably perceptive, and Victoria could see Bradley's face flush with embarrassment. Marcus had clearly witnessed some version of the lockout, and his confusion was evident. "That's a good question, Marcus," Victoria said, standing up and addressing the room. "I'd like to hear the answer myself." Tyler, the 12-year-old middle child, spoke up from across the room. "Mom told us that Grandma Victoria might not be able to come because she was busy with her boyfriend." The revelation struck the room like lightning. Stephanie's face went pale, and Bradley looked as shocked as Victoria felt. Whatever story had been constructed to explain Victoria's potential absence, it clearly hadn't been coordinated with all family members. "Tyler," Stephanie said sharply, "that's not exactly what I said." "Yes, it is," Emma chimed in with 8-year-old certainty. "You said Grandma Victoria was spending too much time with Mr. Morrison and might not remember about the party." Victoria felt a cold fury building in her chest. The children had been told that she might not attend her own birthday celebration because she was too distracted by her romantic relationship to remember family obligations. The calculated cruelty of using her grandchildren to spread such a narrative was breathtaking. Caroline's expression had gone from confused to outraged. "Stephanie, you told the children that Mom might not show up to her own birthday party because she was too busy with David." "I was trying to prepare them for the possibility that plans might change," Stephanie replied defensively. Given the recent developments in Victoria's personal life, it seemed prudent to manage expectations. "What recent developments?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying the authority she had developed through decades of business negotiations. "David and I have been seeing each other for 6 months. We have dinner once or twice a week, attend occasional cultural events, and spend quiet evenings together. How exactly does that constitute developments that would affect my attendance at family celebrations? Bradley cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mom, it's not just about your attendance. It's about the decisions you've been making, the way David might be influencing your thinking about the business. Give me one specific example, Victoria demanded. The request seemed to catch Bradley off guard. He glanced at Stephanie, who was clearly calculating her next move. Janet Reeves, perhaps sensing that her daughter needed support, stepped forward again. Victoria, I hope you understand that the family is just concerned about protecting everyone's interests. When significant business assets are involved, it's natural for people to worry about outside influences. Mr. Morrison isn't an outside influence, Victoria replied coolly. He's a respected estate planning attorney who has been helping to structure the succession plan in a way that protects everyone's interests, including Bradley's. But he's also your romantic partner, Stephanie said, which creates a potential conflict of interest. The accusation was so legally and ethically baseless that Victoria almost laughed. Stephanie, David Morrison has been practicing estate and business law for over 40 years. His professional integrity is beyond question, and his personal relationship with me, if anything, makes him more invested in ensuring that my family's interests are properly protected. That's assuming his advice is genuinely in your best interest, Bradley said, and there was something in his tone that Victoria found deeply troubling. But what if he's encouraging you to make decisions that benefit him rather than the family? Victoria stared at her son, trying to understand what he was suggesting. Bradley, what exactly do you think David Morrison has to gain from giving me poor legal advice? Financial gain, Stephanie answered for her husband. If he's planning a future with you, then any changes to your estate planning or business structure could directly benefit him. The implication hung in the room like a toxic cloud. They were suggesting that David Morrison, a successful attorney with his own substantial assets, was somehow manipulating a 70-year-old woman for financial gain. The accusation was not only offensive but revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both David's character and Victoria's capability. Caroline's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. Are you seriously suggesting that a successful estate planning attorney is somehow conning our mother for her money? We're suggesting that romantic relationships can cloud judgment, Stephanie replied smoothly, especially when someone has been alone for as long as Victoria has been. The condescending tone in Stephanie's voice when she referred to Victoria's decades of widowhood was the final straw. Victoria had built a multi-million-dollar business, raised 2 successful children as a single mother, and navigated complex financial and legal challenges for nearly 4 decades. The suggestion that she was somehow vulnerable to manipulation because she had found companionship in her 70s was both insulting and revealing. I see, Victoria said quietly. So in your view, I'm too old and too lonely to make rational decisions about my own life and business. That's not what we're saying, Bradley protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what exactly are you saying? Because from where I stand, it sounds like you've decided that my personal life represents a threat to your financial expectations, and you've constructed an elaborate justification for questioning my judgment and excluding me from family events. The directness of Victoria's assessment seemed to shock everyone into silence. Even the children had gone quiet, sensing that something significant was happening, even if they didn't fully understand the implications. Margaret, Victoria's sister, who had been sitting quietly on the edge of the room throughout this confrontation, finally spoke up. Victoria, I think there might be some misunderstandings here that could be cleared up if everyone just took a step back. I don't think these are misunderstandings, Margaret, Victoria replied. I think these are deliberate choices. The question is what those choices reveal about family loyalty and respect. Tyler, who had been listening intently to the adult conversation with the focused attention of a 12-year-old trying to understand complex dynamics, suddenly spoke up. Grandma Victoria, are you going to stop being our grandmother? The innocent question pierced Victoria's heart. No, Tyler. I will always be your grandmother, and I will always love you. Nothing that happens between the adults in this family will ever change that. But Dad said that you might be making new family arrangements. Emma added, her 8-year-old face creased with confusion. Victoria looked sharply at Bradley. What new family arrangements? Bradley's face flushed deep red. I didn't say that, Emma. You misunderstood. No, I didn't, Emma insisted with childish certainty. You told Mom that Grandma Victoria might want to have a new family with Mr. Morrison instead of us. The revelation struck Victoria like a physical blow. Her son had been discussing with his wife the possibility that her relationship with David Morrison represented some kind of abandonment of her existing family obligations. The toxic nature of such thinking was staggering. Bradley, Victoria said quietly, do you really believe that finding companionship at 70 years old means I want to abandon my children and grandchildren? I don't know what to believe anymore. Bradley replied, his voice carrying a petulance that reminded Victoria uncomfortably of his teenage years. You've been secretive about this relationship, making decisions without consulting the family. Secretive? Victoria's voice rose slightly. I introduced David to you and Caroline 6 months ago. We've had dinner together as a family 3 times. He attended Emma's school play last month. How exactly have I been secretive? You didn't tell us you were considering marriage, Stephanie interjected. The statement hung in the room like an accusation. Victoria stared at her daughter-in-law, trying to understand where such an idea could have originated. I'm not considering marriage, Stephanie. David and I enjoy each other's company. We're exploring the possibility of a committed relationship, but neither of us has mentioned marriage. Janet heard from her neighbor, who works at the jewelry store downtown, that David Morrison was looking at engagement rings. Stephanie said triumphantly, as if this secondhand gossip represented definitive proof of deception. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, trying to process the absurdity of what she was hearing. Her family had constructed an entire narrative of betrayal and financial threat based on neighborhood gossip about jewelry shopping. Even if that were true, Caroline said, her voice tight with anger, even if Mom and David were planning to get married, how would that justify locking her out of her own birthday party? Because marriage would change everything, Bradley said, his voice gaining strength as if he finally felt he was on solid ground. It would affect the business succession, the estate planning, the children's inheritance. Everything we've worked toward could be compromised. Victoria opened her eyes and looked at her son with a clarity that was both painful and liberating. Bradley, what exactly do you think you've worked toward? The question seemed to confuse him. The business, Mom, Sterling Logistics. Our family's future. Your family's future, Victoria corrected. Not our family's future, because, apparently, my future, my happiness, my right to companionship in my 70s, none of that matters, as long as it doesn't interfere with your financial expectations. The bluntness of her assessment created another uncomfortable silence. Victoria could see family members shifting in their seats, looking at the floor anywhere but at her face as the full implications of the situation became clear. That's not fair, Bradley protested. Everything I've done has been for the family, for the business you built. No, Bradley. Everything you've done has been for the business I built that you expect to inherit. There's a significant difference. Marcus, who had been listening to this exchange with the intense focus of a teenager trying to understand adult complexities, suddenly spoke up again. Grandma Victoria, if you get married, does that mean you won't give Dad the company? The question, asked with teenage directness, cut to the heart of what this confrontation was really about. Victoria looked at her eldest grandchild, seeing in his face both innocent curiosity and a shrewdness that reminded her of herself at that age. Marcus, the transfer of Sterling Logistics to your father has been planned for years. My personal relationships don't change those plans. But my personal relationships also don't require anyone's permission or approval. Then why is everyone so upset? Tyler asked. Victoria looked around the room at the faces of her family members, seeing fear, greed, manipulation, and genuine confusion in various combinations. After 70 years of life and 40 years of business leadership, she was finally beginning to understand what she was really dealing with. That, she said quietly, is an excellent question, Tyler. And I think it's time for all the adults in this room to answer it honestly. The weight of Tyler's innocent question settled over the room like desert dust after a windstorm, making everyone acutely aware of the toxic atmosphere that had developed around what should have been a joyful family celebration. Victoria watched the faces around her, noting how her direct challenge had stripped away the polite facades and revealed the raw calculations beneath. Janet Reeves was the first to attempt damage control, her real estate training evident in the way she tried to redirect the conversation toward safer territory. Perhaps we're all getting a bit too intense about what are really just normal family concerns. Why don't we focus on celebrating Victoria's birthday and save the business discussions for another time? But Victoria had spent 4 decades reading people across negotiating tables, and she recognized a strategic retreat when she saw one. The suggestion to postpone the conversation was really an attempt to reset the dynamic, to allow time for better talking points to be developed and more sophisticated justifications to be constructed. Actually, Janet, I think we need to finish this conversation right now, Victoria said firmly, because I'm beginning to understand that this isn't really about David Morrison or succession planning or even about my birthday. This is about something much more fundamental. Caroline, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the confrontation, stepped closer to her mother in a gesture of solidarity. "What do you mean, Mom?" Victoria looked around the room, taking in the expensive furnishings she had helped select, the artwork she had helped purchase, the very roof over their heads that her money had provided. The irony of being made to feel unwelcome in a house she owned while discussing the transfer of a business she had built was not lost on her. "I mean that this entire situation has been orchestrated to send me a message about my place in this family going forward," Victoria said. "The locked gate, the children being told I might not attend, the accusations about David's influence, even having Janet here as a witness, none of this is accidental." Bradley's face had gone pale, and Victoria could see him calculating whether to continue the charade or admit to the planning that had clearly gone into this confrontation. Stephanie, however, seemed to recognize that their strategy had been exposed and chose to abandon subtlety altogether. "You're right," Stephanie said, her pharmaceutical sales polish giving way to something harder and more direct. "This conversation was planned because the family needed to address some serious concerns about your recent behavior and its potential impact on everyone's future." The admission sent a ripple of shock through the room. Even Bradley looked surprised that his wife had chosen to acknowledge the coordinated nature of the confrontation. Margaret, Victoria's sister, actually gasped audibly. "Stephanie," Bradley said urgently, "I don't think this is the right approach." "No, Bradley, I think it's exactly the right approach," Stephanie replied, turning to face Victoria directly. "We've been tiptoeing around these issues for months, trying to be respectful and patient, but your relationship with David Morrison has forced our hand." Victoria felt a cold clarity settling over her, the kind of analytical detachment that had served her well in the most challenging business negotiations. "Forcing your hand? How, exactly?" "By threatening the carefully planned transition that was supposed to secure everyone's future," Stephanie continued, her voice gaining confidence as she apparently decided to commit fully to this more aggressive approach. "Bradley has been working toward taking over Sterling Logistics for years. He's sacrificed other opportunities, invested his time and energy in learning the business, and built relationships with key clients. And now, just when everything is supposed to come together, you're introducing variables that could derail the entire plan." "What variables?" Caroline demanded. "Mom dating someone? Mom having a personal life? Mom potentially restructuring her estate planning to benefit her new boyfriend?" Stephanie shot back. "Mom making emotional decisions that could affect the business transition. Mom potentially getting remarried and creating new inheritance complications that could affect our children's future." Victoria listened to this litany of fears and concerns, noting how each one revealed more about Stephanie's priorities than about any real threats to the family's well-being. The focus was entirely on financial outcomes, on protecting expected inheritance, on ensuring that no external factors interfered with the transfer of wealth from Victoria to Bradley to their children. "Stephanie," Victoria said quietly, "help me understand something. In your view, what role should I play in my own life? The question seemed to catch Stephanie off guard. What do you mean? I mean that everything you've described as problematic involves me making independent decisions about my personal life, my business, my estate planning, so I'm wondering what role you think I should have in those decisions. We think you should make decisions that consider the impact on the entire family. Bradley interjected, apparently feeling the need to support his wife's position, not just what makes you happy in the moment. The response was so revealing that Victoria almost smiled. Her son, the beneficiary of everything she had built, was arguing that her happiness should be secondary to other family members' financial expectations. I see, Victoria said. So at 70 years old, after building a successful business, raising 2 children as a single mother, and providing financial security for multiple generations of this family, my primary obligation is to ensure that my personal choices don't interfere with other people's inheritance expectations. That's not what we're saying, Bradley protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Then, what are you saying? Because from where I stand, it sounds like you've appointed yourselves as overseers of my personal life, with veto power over any decisions that might affect your financial interests. Marcus, who had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention of a teenager, trying to understand adult motivations, suddenly spoke up. Dad, are you mad at Grandma Victoria because she has a boyfriend? The simplicity of the question cut through all the sophisticated justifications and financial concerns, reducing the conflict to its emotional core. Bradley's face flushed again, and Victoria could see him struggling to find an answer that wouldn't sound petty when addressed to his own son. It's not about being mad, Marcus, Bradley said finally. It's about being concerned about how big decisions get made. But Grandma Victoria can make her own decisions, can't she? Emma asked with 8-year-old logic. She's a grown-up. The innocence of her granddaughter's observations struck Victoria with unexpected force. After 4 decades of independence, of making complex business decisions that affected hundreds of employees, of navigating financial challenges and legal complexities, she was being treated as if she lacked the capacity to manage her own personal relationships. Emma's right, Caroline said, her surgeon's precision evident in the way she cut to the heart of the matter. Mom is perfectly capable of making her own decisions. The real question is why anyone thinks they have the right to approve or disapprove of those decisions. Because those decisions affect all of us, Stephanie replied, her voice rising slightly as she apparently felt the moral ground shifting beneath her feet. When you're talking about the kind of wealth that Sterling Logistics represents, when you're dealing with business succession and estate planning, every decision has implications for the entire family. Whose wealth? Victoria asked quietly. The question hung in the air, like a challenge. Stephanie's face went pale as she realized what she had revealed in her choice of words. I misspoke, Stephanie said quickly. I meant the family's wealth. The business that benefits everyone. No, Victoria replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had built an empire from nothing. You spoke accurately the first time. You're talking about my wealth. The wealth I created through 40 years of 18-hour days, calculated risks and personal sacrifice, the wealth that I have every right to dispose of as I see fit. The room went completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the conversation, that this was no longer about birthday parties or family dynamics, but about something much more significant. Bradley cleared his throat nervously. Mom, we're not questioning your right to make decisions about your money. We're just concerned that those decisions should take everyone's interests into account. Everyone except mine. Apparently, Victoria replied, because everything you've described as problematic involves me prioritizing my own happiness and well-being over other people's financial expectations. Janet Reeves, who had been quietly observing this family implosion, chose this moment to insert herself back into the conversation. Victoria, I think there might be some miscommunication here. Nobody wants to control your personal life. The family is just concerned about protecting everyone's interests during what is naturally a vulnerable transition period. Victoria turned to look at Janet directly, studying the older woman's carefully composed expression. As Stephanie's mother, Janet had clearly been brought in to provide support and perhaps additional credibility to whatever case was being made against Victoria's independence. Janet, can I ask you something directly? How much do you know about Sterling Logistics' financial structure and succession planning? The question seemed to catch Janet off guard. Well, I know it's a very successful business that provides security for the whole family. Do you know that I currently maintain controlling interest in the company? That the succession plan has been carefully structured over multiple years to ensure a smooth transition? That David Morrison's involvement has actually strengthened the legal framework protecting everyone's interests? Janet's uncomfortable silence provided the answer. She had been briefed on talking points and family concerns, but she clearly lacked detailed knowledge about the actual business and legal realities. I thought not, Victoria continued. So you're supporting a position about my business decisions without actually understanding what those decisions involve or how they affect the business. Mom, Bradley interjected, that's not fair. We're not questioning your business expertise. We're concerned about how personal relationships might cloud professional judgment. Bradley, in 40 years of running Sterling Logistics, can you point to a single instance where my personal relationships compromised my business judgment? The question was devastating in its simplicity. Bradley stared at his mother, clearly unable to provide an example because none existed. Victoria had built her business through careful planning, conservative financial management, and clear separation between personal and professional concerns. That's different, Stephanie said defensively. You weren't in a romantic relationship during those years. Romance can make people act irrationally, especially at your age. The condescending reference to Victoria's age as a factor that might compromise her judgment was perhaps the most insulting thing that had been said during the entire confrontation. Victoria felt her carefully controlled anger finally beginning to surface. At my age, Victoria repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. Are you suggesting that being 70 years old makes me less capable of rational decision-making? I'm suggesting that people can be more vulnerable to manipulation when they've been alone for a long time. Stephanie replied, apparently deciding to commit fully to this line of argument. The accusation hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Victoria looked around the room, seeing the shocked expressions on her family members' faces as the full scope of Stephanie's condescension became clear. Let me make sure I understand, Victoria said, her voice carrying the steel that had made her a formidable business leader. In your view, I'm too old, too lonely, and too emotionally vulnerable to make rational decisions about my own life, despite building a multi-million-dollar business, despite raising 2 successful children as a single mother, despite 40 years of sound financial and legal decision-making. You believe I now require supervision and approval from my children and their spouses. That's not what I said, Stephanie protested, but her face was flushed with the recognition that she had overplayed her hand. That's exactly what you said, Caroline interjected, her voice tight with fury. You just accused our mother of being mentally compromised by age and loneliness. Tyler, who had been following this conversation with the focused attention of a 12-year-old trying to understand complex adult dynamics, suddenly spoke up again. Mom, does that mean you think Grandma Victoria is too old to think right? The innocent question, asked with childish directness, forced everyone in the room to confront what Stephanie had actually said. The suggestion that Victoria's age made her vulnerable to manipulation was not only insulting but revealed the underlying attitudes that had driven this entire confrontation. Tyler, that's not what I meant, Stephanie said quickly, but the damage was done. Then what did you mean? Marcus asked, his 15-year-old sense of justice clearly engaged. Because it sounded like you were saying Grandma Victoria can't make good decisions anymore. Victoria watched her grandchildren defend her capacity and dignity with a fierce loyalty that stood in stark contrast to their parents' financial calculations. The irony was not lost on her that the youngest members of the family were the only ones who seemed to understand that her worth was not dependent on her utility to their financial expectations. Children, Victoria said gently, why don't you go to the kitchen and see if there's any of that chocolate cake left? I think the adults need to finish this conversation privately. But we want to stay with you, Grandma Victoria, Emma said, moving closer to her grandmother's side. The simple gesture of loyalty from her 8-year-old granddaughter nearly broke Victoria's composure. These children, at least, saw her as a person deserving of respect and affection, not as an aging asset whose personal choices needed to be managed for their financial benefit. I know, sweetheart, and I love you for that, but this is a grown-up business that we need to resolve. As the children reluctantly moved toward the kitchen, Victoria turned back to face the adults who had orchestrated this birthday ambush. The polite pretenses had been stripped away, the real motivations exposed, and the fundamental disrespect revealed. What happened next would determine not just the future of her relationship with Bradley and Stephanie, but the very nature of her role in her own life and family. The 70-year-old woman who had been locked out of her own birthday party was about to make some decisions that would surprise everyone in that room, including herself. As the children's voices faded into the kitchen, Victoria found herself standing in the center of her son's living room, surrounded by adults who had just revealed the depth of their disrespect for her autonomy and judgment. The birthday cake sat untouched on the dining room table, a mockery of celebration in a room thick with manipulation and betrayal. For 40 years, Victoria had navigated complex business negotiations, but nothing had prepared her for this moment, when her own family had become her adversaries. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Margaret, Victoria's sister, finally spoke up with the careful tone of someone trying to mediate a family crisis. Maybe we should all take a step back here. Emotions are running high, and things are being said that people might regret later. Victoria turned to look at Margaret, noting the diplomatic language that avoided taking sides while implicitly suggesting that the problem was emotional volatility rather than fundamental disrespect. After 68 years as sisters, Victoria recognized Margaret's pattern of minimizing conflict rather than addressing its root causes. Margaret, I appreciate your concern, but I don't think this is about emotions running high. I think this is about some very calculated decisions that have been made about my role in this family going forward. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his expensive casual shirt, the one Stephanie had probably selected for him as part of her careful staging of this confrontation. Mom, that's not true. Nobody has made decisions about your role. We're just trying to have a conversation about concerns that affect everyone. A conversation. Victoria's voice carried the quiet authority that had made boardrooms full of executives pay attention. Bradley, conversations typically involve mutual respect and open dialogue. What happened here today was an ambush. I was locked out of my own birthday party, accused of mental incompetence due to my age, and subjected to character assassination of a man you barely know. That's not a conversation, that's a coordinated attack. Stephanie's face flushed, but she maintained her defensive stance. Nobody attacked anyone. We raised legitimate concerns about decisions that could affect the entire family's future. Whose future? Victoria asked, echoing her earlier question. Because everything you've described as concerning involves protecting your expectations about inheriting my wealth. Not protecting my well-being, not supporting my happiness, not respecting my autonomy, just ensuring that my personal choices don't interfere with your financial plans. Janet Reeves, who had been observing this exchange with the calculating attention of someone trying to assess which side was winning, chose this moment to interject again. Victoria, I think you might be misinterpreting the family's motivation. From what I understand, everyone just wants to make sure the business transition goes smoothly for all concerned. Victoria studied Janet's face, noting the practiced sincerity that probably served her well in real estate transactions. But Victoria had spent decades reading people who were trying to manipulate negotiations in their favor. And she recognized the technique of reframing selfish motivations as general concern. Janet, since you seem to be positioned as some kind of neutral observer here, let me ask you directly, do you think I should have been locked out of my own birthday party? The direct question visibly flustered Janet. Well, I wasn't involved in those logistics. I'm sure there was some misunderstanding about timing or arrangements. There was no misunderstanding. Victoria replied firmly, Your daughter and my son deliberately changed the locks on this house without informing me. then constructed a story about why I might not attend my own celebration. That wasn't a logistics error, that was a deliberate exclusion designed to send a message about power dynamics in this family. Caroline, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout this exchange, stepped forward. Mom's absolutely right. This whole situation is unacceptable. Bradley, I cannot believe you participated in locking our mother out of her own birthday party. Caroline, you don't understand the full situation, Bradley protested. There are business complexities that you're not aware of. Then, explain them, Caroline demanded. Explain exactly what business complexities justify treating our mother like she's incompetent to manage her own life. Bradley glanced at Stephanie, and Victoria caught the look that passed between them. It was the same kind of coordinated communication she had witnessed throughout the confrontation, the silent negotiation between partners about how much to reveal and what strategy to pursue. The succession plan for Sterling Logistics is more complicated than you realize, Bradley said finally. There are tax implications, legal structures, timing considerations. David Morrison's involvement has introduced variables that could potentially cost the family millions of dollars in additional taxes and legal complications. Victoria felt a flash of anger at the continued misrepresentation of David's role. Bradley, that's completely false, and you know it. David's legal advice has actually saved the family money by structuring the transition more efficiently than our previous attorneys recommended. According to him, Stephanie interjected, but we've consulted with other attorneys who have different opinions about the optimal structure. The revelation stopped Victoria cold. You've consulted with other attorneys, without informing me. The uncomfortable silence that followed provided the answer. Victoria realized she was looking at a level of betrayal that went far beyond birthday party exclusions or concerns about her dating life. Her son and daughter-in-law had been actively working behind her scenes to restructure the business transition, potentially undermining agreements that had taken years to develop. What attorneys? Victoria asked, her voice carrying the steel that had made difficult negotiations tremble. Mom, we just wanted to get a second opinion, Bradley said weakly, to make sure all options were being considered, without consulting the person who owns the business, without informing the CEO whose company you're discussing. Bradley, do you understand that what you've described could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty? The legal terminology seemed to hit Bradley like a physical blow. As someone who had been learning the business operations, he was familiar enough with corporate governance to understand the implications of working against the interests of the company's owner and CEO. It wasn't like that, he protested. We were just exploring options. Options for what? Caroline demanded. For undermining Mom's authority in her own company. Victoria held up a hand to forestall Caroline's intervention. She needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening behind her back before deciding how to respond. Bradley, I want you to tell me exactly what discussions you've had with other attorneys, what information you've shared, and what recommendations you've received. The direct demand for disclosure created another moment of tense silence. Victoria could see Bradley calculating whether honesty or continued evasion would serve him better at this point. We consulted with Morrison, Barrett and Associates, Stephanie answered for her husband, apparently deciding that some level of transparency was unavoidable. They specialize in family business transitions and estate planning. Victoria knew the firm well. They were competitors of David Morrison's practice, known for aggressive strategies that often prioritized immediate tax benefits over long-term family relationships. The choice of that particular firm was revealing in itself. And what did Morrison Barrett recommend? Victoria asked. They suggested that the transition could be structured more favorably if certain changes were made to the timeline and ownership transfer mechanisms. Bradley replied, his voice gaining confidence as he apparently felt he was back on solid ground. What kind of changes? Stephanie and Bradley exchanged another look, and Victoria realized she was about to hear something that would fundamentally alter her understanding of the situation. They recommended accelerating the ownership transfer, Stephanie said, moving up the timeline so that Bradley assumes controlling interest within the next 6 months rather than the gradual transition that's currently planned. The suggestion was so financially and strategically reckless that Victoria wondered if she had misheard. The current succession plan had been carefully structured to ensure business continuity, tax efficiency, and protection for all parties involved. Accelerating the timeline would expose the company to unnecessary risks and potentially create tax liabilities that could cost millions. And the justification for this acceleration? Victoria asked. To protect the business from potential complications that could arise from your personal relationships, Bradley replied, apparently emboldened by his wife's directness. Victoria stared at her son, finally understanding the full scope of what she was dealing with. This wasn't just about birthday party exclusions or concerns about David Morrison's influence. This was about a coordinated effort to force her out of active leadership of her own company, using her personal life as justification for a power grab that would benefit Bradley and Stephanie at significant cost to the business and the family. I see, Victoria said quietly. So the plan is to use manufactured concerns about my competence and David's influence to justify forcing me into early retirement from the company I built. That's not how we see it, Stephanie protested. We see it as protecting the company's future by ensuring stable leadership during a potentially volatile period. Volatile period? Victoria's voice carried a dangerous edge. Stephanie, Sterling Logistics has just completed its most profitable year in company history. Our client relationships are stronger than ever, our operational efficiency is at record levels, and our market position continues to expand. What exactly makes this a volatile period requiring emergency leadership changes? Your relationship with David Morrison, Bradley answered. The potential for emotional decision-making that could affect the business. Victoria looked at her son with a clarity that was both painful and liberating. After 40 years of building a business empire, after decades of sound financial and strategic decision-making, after proving her competence in countless challenging situations, she was being told that finding companionship at 70 made her unfit to lead the company she had created. Bradley, in your honest assessment, has my business judgment been compromised since I began seeing David Morrison? The question forced Bradley to confront the disconnect between his accusations and observable reality. Victoria's leadership of Sterling Logistics had remained steady and profitable throughout the 6 months of her relationship with David. It's not about current performance, Bradley said uncomfortably. It's about future risks. Future risks based on what evidence? What data? What precedent? Bradley, you're asking me to accept that after 40 years of successful business leadership, I should step aside because of theoretical future risks that exist only in your imagination. Caroline, who had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, stepped forward again. Mom, what they're describing sounds like they're trying to stage some kind of corporate coup. That's exactly what it sounds like, Victoria replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was realizing. And the birthday party exclusion was apparently meant to soften me up for the proposal, to demonstrate that my family relationships are contingent on my compliance with their business agenda. The accusation hit the room like lightning. Even Margaret looked shocked at the implication that the family gathering had been orchestrated as part of a business strategy. Victoria, that's a very serious allegation, Margaret said carefully. It's a very serious situation, Victoria replied. My son and daughter-in-law have been secretly consulting with attorneys about forcing me out of my own company. They've constructed elaborate justifications for questioning my mental competence, and they've used my own birthday celebration as a venue for emotional manipulation. If that's not serious, I don't know what is. Tyler's voice suddenly cut through the adult tension as he appeared in the kitchen doorway. Grandma Victoria, are you leaving? Emma's crying because she thinks you're mad at us. The innocent question from her 12-year-old grandson pierced Victoria's heart. In the midst of this corporate and family betrayal, she had forgotten about the children who were witnessing their family implode around them. Tyler, I'm not mad at you or Emma, or Marcus, Victoria said gently, kneeling down to his level. But I need to have some important conversations with the grown-ups about family business. Are you going to fire Dad? Tyler asked with the directness that only children can manage. The question hung in the air like a sword. Victoria looked up at Bradley, seeing in his face the sudden realization that his mother still held controlling interest in Sterling Logistics, that all his planning with alternative attorneys and accelerated timelines meant nothing without her consent. "That depends," Victoria said, rising to her full height and addressing the room, "on whether your father and I can find a way to rebuild the trust that's been damaged today." But even as she spoke the words, Victoria was beginning to understand that some betrayals cut too deep for simple repair. The son who had locked her out of her own birthday party, who had questioned her mental competence, who had secretly plotted to force her from the company she had built, that son might not be someone she could trust with her life's work after all. The real birthday surprise was just beginning to unfold, and it would be far more dramatic than anything Bradley and Stephanie had planned. The weight of Tyler's question about firing his father hung in the air like smoke from a desert wildfire, spreading through the room and touching everyone present with its implications. Victoria looked at her grandson's earnest face, seeing in his 12-year-old eyes a reflection of the innocence that was about to be shattered by adult greed and manipulation. The irony was devastating. A child was asking whether his grandmother would destroy his father's career, while that same father had spent months plotting to destroy his mother's autonomy. Victoria's phone buzzed in her purse, breaking the tense silence. She glanced at the screen and saw David Morrison's name. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or more revealing about the family's priorities. "Excuse me," Victoria said, stepping toward the window for privacy. "David." "Hello?" "Victoria, happy birthday, darling." David's warm voice carried clearly through the phone, and Victoria was acutely aware that everyone in the room could hear his affectionate greeting. "I just wanted to confirm our dinner plans for tomorrow night. I have some wonderful news to share with you." The mention of news sent a visible ripple of anxiety through Bradley and Stephanie. Victoria caught their exchange of alarmed glances and realized they were probably imagining engagement announcements or wedding plans. The very scenarios they had used to justify their intervention. "That sounds lovely, David," Victoria replied, keeping her voice deliberately warm. "I'm looking forward to hearing your news. How's the birthday celebration going? Are you having a wonderful time with the family?" Victoria looked around the room at the faces watching her with varying degrees of hostility, calculation, and concern. "It's been quite educational," she said carefully. "I'm learning a great deal about family dynamics that I hadn't fully understood before." "That sounds intriguing." "Well, I won't keep you from your party. Give my best to Bradley and Caroline, and I'll see you tomorrow evening." As Victoria ended the call, she could see the speculation and worry in Bradley and Stephanie's faces. They were clearly wondering what news David might have to share, what implications it might hold for their carefully laid plans. "Was that your boyfriend?" Emma asked, having returned from the kitchen with chocolate frosting on her fingers. "That was Mr. Morrison," Victoria confirmed gently. "He called to wish me a happy birthday. Are you going to marry him?" Marcus asked with teenage directness. The question sent another wave of tension through the adult members of the family. Victoria could practically see Stephanie's mind racing through worst-case scenarios involving prenuptial agreements, estate planning complications, and threats to the inheritance expectations she had been so carefully protecting. "Marcus, that's a very personal question," Victoria replied diplomatically. "Mr. Morrison and I enjoy each other's company very much, but any decisions about our future together would be made carefully and with consideration for everyone involved." "Everyone except us, apparently," Stephanie muttered, apparently forgetting that children were present. Emma looked up at her mother with confusion. "Mommy, why would Grandma Victoria marrying Mr. Morrison not include us?" The 8-year-old's innocent question exposed the toxicity of Stephanie's thinking in a way that no adult challenge could have accomplished. Stephanie's face flushed as she realized she had revealed her exclusionary mindset in front of the children. "That's not what I meant, Emma," Stephanie said quickly. "I just meant that big decisions affect everyone, so everyone should have a say. But grown-ups can decide who they want to marry," Tyler pointed out with 12-year-old logic. "You and Dad didn't ask us if you should get married." The comparison was devastating in its simplicity. Tyler had inadvertently highlighted the absurdity of suggesting that Victoria's romantic decisions required family approval, while Bradley and Stephanie's marriage had been entirely their own choice. Victoria watched this exchange with growing clarity about what needed to happen next. The children's innocent observations were cutting through the sophisticated justifications and revealing the fundamental unfairness of the position her son and daughter-in-law had taken. "Tyler makes an excellent point," Victoria said. "Adults do have the right to make their own decisions about marriage and relationships. That's been true for all of us." Bradley cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mom, it's different when there are business assets involved, when there are inheritance implications for multiple generations." "Is it?" Victoria asked. "Bradley, when you married Stephanie, did you consult me about the potential implications for Sterling Logistics? Did you ask for my approval based on how your marriage might affect business decisions or estate planning?" The question clearly caught Bradley off guard. "That was different. I wasn't the CEO of a major company when I got married." "No, but you were the heir apparent to a major company. You were someone whose personal decisions could potentially affect business operations and family wealth. Yet I don't recall subjecting Stephanie to intense scrutiny about her motivations or demanding approval of your relationship." Stephanie's face had gone pale as she began to understand where this line of reasoning was leading. "Victoria, that's not a fair comparison. Bradley wasn't making decisions that could affect the company's ownership structure." "Neither am I," Victoria replied firmly. "David Morrison is helping to strengthen the succession planning that's already in place. He's not encouraging me to change it in ways that would disadvantage you or Bradley, but even if he were, the fundamental question would remain: who has the right to make decisions about my personal life and business assets?" Caroline, who had been listening to this exchange with growing admiration for her mother's logical precision, stepped forward. "Mom's absolutely right. The double standard here is incredible. Bradley and Stephanie made their own choices about marriage, about where to live, about how to raise their children, about career decisions, but somehow Mom's choices require committee approval." "It's about protecting everyone's interests," Janet Reeves interjected, apparently feeling the need to support her daughter's position. "When significant wealth is involved, families need to work together to ensure responsible decision-making." Victoria turned to look at Janet directly. "Janet, can I ask you something? What role did Stephanie's family play in approving your marriage to her father?" The question visibly flustered Janet. "Well, that's different. We weren't dealing with the kind of wealth and business complexity that's involved here. So the difference is the amount of money involved. The suggestion is that above a certain wealth threshold, individuals lose the right to make independent decisions about their personal lives." "That's not what anyone is saying," Bradley protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's exactly what you're saying," Victoria replied. "You're arguing that my financial success has somehow disqualified me from the same personal autonomy that every other adult in this family takes for granted." Marcus, who had been following this conversation with the intense focus of a teenager trying to understand complex adult dynamics, suddenly spoke up again. "Grandma Victoria, if you can't decide who to marry because you have a lot of money, does that mean rich people can't fall in love?" The question, asked with such earnest curiosity, struck the room like lightning. Out of the mouths of babes came a wisdom that cut through all the financial complexity and legal maneuvering to the emotional heart of the matter. "That's a very insightful question, Marcus," Victoria said gently. "What do you think?" "I think that's stupid," Marcus replied with teenage bluntness. "Money shouldn't stop people from being happy." "Marcus," Stephanie said sharply, "that's not an appropriate way to talk about family financial matters." "Why not?" Marcus challenged, his 15-year-old sense of justice clearly engaged. "Grandma Victoria worked hard to earn her money. Why should that mean she can't have a boyfriend?" Victoria felt a surge of pride in her grandson's moral clarity. At 15, Marcus could see through the sophisticated justifications to the fundamental unfairness of the position his parents had taken. "Marcus is asking the right questions," Victoria said, "and I think it's time for some honest answers." She moved to the center of the room, positioning herself so she could address everyone present. The moment felt significant, like standing at a crossroads where one path led back to the familiar patterns of manipulation and control, while the other led toward an uncertain but more authentic future. "I want to share something with all of you," Victoria began, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect in boardrooms for 4 decades. "When I started Sterling Logistics 40 years ago, I was a widow with 2 young children and a pickup truck. I built that company through 18-hour days, calculated risks, and an absolute determination to provide security for my family." She paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected varying degrees of attention, anxiety, and calculation. "For 40 years, I've made every major business decision with my family's well-being as the primary consideration. I've structured growth plans around providing opportunities for Bradley. I've managed financial resources to ensure security for multiple generations. I've sacrificed personal relationships, social opportunities, and my own immediate gratification to build something that would benefit everyone in this room." Victoria's voice remained steady, but there was an emotional undertone that made everyone lean forward slightly. "6 months ago, at the age of 70, I met a man who makes me laugh, who challenges me intellectually, who treats me with respect and affection. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, I found companionship that enriches my life without requiring me to diminish myself or apologize for my success." She looked directly at Bradley as she continued. "What I discovered today is that my family views this happiness as a threat. Not because David Morrison is somehow harmful or manipulative, but because my personal fulfillment might interfere with financial expectations that have been constructed around my continued sacrifice." Stephanie started to protest, but Victoria held up a hand to stop her. "Let me finish. What happened here today wasn't about protecting family interests or ensuring business stability. It was about maintaining a power structure where my role is to provide financial security for others while accepting whatever personal limitations are deemed necessary to preserve that arrangement." The room had gone completely silent. Even the children seemed to sense that something momentous was happening. "The birthday party lockout was a message," Victoria continued. "It was designed to demonstrate that my place in this family is conditional on my compliance with decisions made by others about my personal life. It was meant to show me that my autonomy is subject to approval by people who benefit from my sacrifice." Victoria's phone buzzed again with another call. She glanced at the screen and saw her attorney's office number. The timing was almost surreal, as if the universe was providing props for the decision she was about to make. "Excuse me," Victoria said, answering the call. "Hello, James." "Victoria, I'm sorry to bother you on your birthday, but I wanted to give you an update on the Morrison Barrett situation you asked me to investigate." Victoria's blood ran cold. She had asked her attorney to look into the competing law firm that Bradley and Stephanie had consulted, but she hadn't expected results so quickly. "What did you find?" Victoria asked, aware that everyone in the room was hanging on every word. "Some very interesting information about their recent activities. It appears they've been contacted by several parties asking about forced competency evaluations for business owners. The inquiries specifically mention circumstances involving elderly CEOs and concerns about romantic relationships affecting judgment." Victoria felt the room spinning around her. "Are you saying they've been researching how to have me declared incompetent?" "I'm saying the pattern of their inquiries suggests they've been exploring legal mechanisms for challenging your fitness to lead Sterling Logistics. I think you need to come in first thing Monday morning to discuss protective measures." As Victoria ended the call, she looked around the room at faces that had gone pale with shock and recognition. The full scope of Bradley and Stephanie's planning was finally clear, and it went far beyond secret attorney consultations and accelerated succession timelines. They had been researching how to have her declared mentally incompetent. The birthday party lockout hadn't been the beginning of their campaign against her autonomy. It had been merely the opening move in what was planned to be a complete takeover of her life and business. Victoria looked at her son, seeing in his face not the boy she had raised, but a stranger who had been willing to destroy her to achieve his own goals. The time for diplomacy and family harmony had ended. The time for decisive action had begun. The silence following Victoria's phone call with her attorney stretched across the room like a chasm, dividing not just family members, but entire concepts of loyalty, respect, and human decency. Victoria stood in the center of the elegant living room she had helped furnish, surrounded by people who had just been exposed as conspirators in what amounted to a plan to steal her life's work by questioning her sanity. The magnitude of the betrayal was so complete that it seemed to alter the very air in the room. Bradley's face had gone ashen, the color draining from his features as the implications of what had been revealed sank in. For months, he had been following Stephanie's lead, accepting her justifications and strategies without fully considering their ultimate destination. Now, confronted with the reality that their planning had included researching competency evaluations, he seemed to be grasping for the first time the true nature of what they had set in motion. "Mom," Bradley said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I never agreed to any competency evaluation. I never wanted things to go that far." Victoria studied her son's face, noting the panic in his eyes, and the way his hands were trembling slightly. After 4 decades of reading people in high-stakes business negotiations, she could distinguish between genuine shock and calculated performance. Bradley's distress appeared authentic, which suggested that Stephanie had been pursuing the most extreme options without his full knowledge or consent. "But you did agree to lock me out of my own birthday party," Victoria replied, her voice carrying the precision of a surgeon making an incision. "You did agree to secret consultations with competing attorneys. You did agree to construct narratives about my mental state and David's influence. The competency evaluation was simply the logical conclusion of the path you had already chosen to follow." Stephanie stepped forward, her pharmaceutical sales training evident in the way she tried to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her management. "Victoria, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the scope of our legal consultations. We were exploring all available options, but that doesn't mean we intended to pursue the most extreme measures." "Exploring all available options," Victoria repeated, allowing the euphemism to hang in the air like an accusation. "Stephanie, when someone researches how to have a 70-year-old woman declared incompetent because she's dating someone, that's not exploring options. That's planning an attack." Caroline, who had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, stepped between her mother and Stephanie. "Are you telling me that you've been researching how to have Mom declared mentally unfit? That you've been planning some kind of legal action to take away her rights?" "We were being thorough," Stephanie replied defensively. "When you're dealing with assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars, you have to consider all possible scenarios and protective measures." "Protective measures?" Caroline's voice rose with indignation. "You're talking about destroying our mother's reputation and autonomy. You're talking about treating a brilliant businesswoman like she's suffering from dementia because she has a boyfriend. How is that protective?" Janet Reeves, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the true scope of her daughter's planning became clear, moved toward the edge of the room as if considering an escape route. "Perhaps I should leave and let the family work through these issues privately." "No, Janet, please stay," Victoria said firmly. "I think it's important for you to understand what your daughter has been planning in your name as family concern." The direct challenge forced Janet to confront her role in enabling Stephanie's schemes. As a real estate professional, Janet understood legal processes and would have known exactly what competency evaluations entailed. Her presence at this confrontation was no accident. She had been brought in to provide credibility and support for whatever measures Stephanie deemed necessary. "Janet," Victoria continued, "as a professional who deals with estate planning and property transfers, you know exactly what a competency evaluation involves. You know the public humiliation, the legal implications, the permanent damage to someone's reputation and autonomy. Did you really believe that was an appropriate response to a 70-year-old woman finding companionship?" Janet's face flushed as she realized she was being held accountable for her complicity rather than being allowed to maintain the fiction of innocent concern. "Victoria, I was only trying to support my daughter's efforts to protect her family's future by helping her plan to destroy mine," Victoria replied. "Janet, I want you to imagine for a moment that your own children decided you were too old and too emotionally compromised to make decisions about your life. Imagine them researching how to have you declared incompetent because they disagreed with your personal choices. How would that feel?" The role reversal clearly struck home. Janet's face crumpled slightly as she began to understand the human impact of the legal strategies they had been contemplating. Marcus, who had been listening to this adult conversation with the focused intensity of a teenager trying to understand complex moral issues, suddenly spoke up. "Mom, Dad, were you really going to try to say Grandma Victoria was crazy?" The directness of his 15-year-old question cut through all the euphemisms and legal terminology, reducing the conspiracy to its essential cruelty. Stephanie looked at her son, clearly struggling to find a way to explain their actions that wouldn't sound monstrous. "Marcus, it's not about saying anyone is crazy," Stephanie said carefully. "It's about making sure that important business decisions are made with clear thinking and without outside influence." "But Grandma Victoria's thinking is clear," Tyler protested with 12-year-old logic. "She built a huge company. She takes care of all of us. She remembers everything and helps me with my math homework. How is that not clear thinking?" Emma, the 8-year-old, looked up at her mother with confusion. "Mommy, are you mad at Grandma Victoria because she has a boyfriend?" The innocent question from her youngest child seemed to hit Stephanie like a physical blow. Reduced to such simple terms, the absurdity of their position became impossible to defend or justify. "Emma, sweetheart, it's complicated," Stephanie said weakly. "No, it's not," Emma replied with the beautiful clarity of childhood. "Grandma Victoria is nice and smart and she loves us. If she wants a boyfriend, that's good. People should be happy." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes at her granddaughter's simple wisdom. After hours of sophisticated manipulation and calculated cruelty, an 8-year-old had distilled the situation to its essential truth: people should be allowed to pursue happiness without persecution from those who claim to love them. "Emma's absolutely right," Victoria said, kneeling down to her granddaughter's level. "People should be happy, and families should support each other's happiness rather than trying to control it." Bradley, who had been growing increasingly agitated as the true implications of their planning became clear, suddenly burst out. "Mom, I never wanted any of this to happen. I just wanted to make sure the business transition went smoothly. I never wanted to hurt you or question your competence." Victoria rose and looked at her son with a mixture of sadness and clarity. "Bradley, intentions matter less than actions. You may not have wanted to hurt me, but you participated in a coordinated effort to manipulate and control me. You locked me out of my own birthday party to send a message about power dynamics. You consulted with attorneys behind my back about forcing me from my own company. Good intentions don't excuse those choices." But Stephanie said it was the only way to protect the family's future. Bradley protested, finally revealing the dynamic that had driven his participation. "Protect it from what?" Victoria asked. "From my happiness? From my personal fulfillment? From the possibility that I might structure my own estate according to my own values rather than other people's expectations?" The questions hung in the air unanswered, because there were no good answers. The threats they had been protecting against were entirely imaginary, constructed to justify actions motivated by greed and control, rather than genuine concern. Victoria's phone rang again, and she saw David Morrison's name on the screen. The timing was perfect for what she needed to do next. "David," she answered, making sure her voice carried clearly through the room. "I'm so glad you called. Victoria, I'm sorry to bother you again, but I just received some disturbing information from a colleague about inquiries that have been made regarding your business and personal affairs. I think we need to discuss some protective legal measures." "I'm one step ahead of you," Victoria replied. "I've just discovered the scope of what's been happening, and I'm ready to take decisive action." "Good. I've been researching some options that would ensure your interests are fully protected. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss strategy?" "Absolutely. In fact, why don't you come by the house tonight?" "I think it's time for some important announcements." As Victoria ended the call, she could see the alarm in Bradley and Stephanie's faces. They were clearly imagining the worst possible scenarios involving legal retaliation and protection of Victoria's assets. "Mom," Bradley said urgently, "please don't make any hasty decisions. Maybe we can work through this as a family." Victoria looked at her son with the same analytical precision she had once used to evaluate potential business partners. Bradley, families work through problems together with honesty, respect, and mutual consideration. What you and Stephanie have done involves deception, manipulation, and planned destruction of my autonomy. That's not family problem solving, that's warfare. It doesn't have to be warfare, Stephanie interjected desperately. We can find a compromise that protects everyone's interests. Whose interests need protection? Victoria asked. Mine. Because I've spent months being deceived and manipulated by people I trusted. My interests would be protected by ensuring that never happens again. Caroline, who had been watching this exchange with growing resolve, stepped forward. Mom, whatever you decide to do, I support you completely. What Bradley and Stephanie have done is unforgivable. Caroline, please don't take sides, Bradley pleaded. This is still a family, and families can work through anything. Some betrayals are too deep for simple forgiveness. Victoria said quietly. Bradley, you researched how to have me declared incompetent. You plan to take away my autonomy, my dignity, my right to make decisions about my own life. That's not a family disagreement. That's an attack on everything I am. As a person. Margaret, Victoria's sister, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable throughout this confrontation, finally spoke up. Victoria, I understand you're hurt and angry, but destroying family relationships over this might be something you'll regret later. Victoria turned to look at Margaret, noting the predictable pattern of minimizing abuse and prioritizing family unity over accountability. Margaret, if someone tried to have you declared incompetent so they could control your assets and personal life, would you consider that a minor family disagreement? That's not what happened here, Margaret protested weakly. That's exactly what happened here, Victoria replied firmly. The only question is what I'm going to do about it. Tyler, who had been following this conversation with the intense focus of someone trying to understand complex adult dynamics, suddenly asked, Grandma Victoria, are you going to punish Mom and Dad? The innocent question forced Victoria to confront the emotional complexity of her situation. These were her grandchildren, innocent victims of their parents' greed and manipulation. Whatever actions she took would inevitably affect them as well. Tyler, I'm going to make some decisions that ensure this kind of thing never happens again, Victoria said gently. But those decisions aren't about punishment, they're about protection and respect. What kind of decisions? Marcus asked with teenage directness. Victoria looked around the room at the faces of her family members, seeing fear, calculation, hope, and resignation in various combinations. After 70 years of life and 40 years of business leadership, she had reached a moment of absolute clarity about what needed to happen. The kind of decisions, Victoria said, her voice carrying the authority that had built an empire, that will ensure everyone understands exactly where they stand going forward. She moved toward her purse, retrieving her phone to make the call that would change everything. David, it's Victoria again. I've changed my mind about tonight. Could you come over right now? I need to make some announcements that can't wait until tomorrow. As she ended the call, Victoria looked around the room one final time, seeing her family in a completely new light. The birthday party that had begun with a lockout was about to end, with revelations that would reshape every relationship in the room. The 70-year-old woman who had been deemed too old and too emotional to make rational decisions was about to demonstrate exactly how clear and decisive her thinking could be. The 30 minutes that passed waiting for David Morrison's arrival felt like hours suspended in amber, each moment crystallizing the irreversible nature of what was about to unfold. Victoria stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Truckee River, watching the desert sunset paint the Nevada sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of the first evening she had dreamed of building something lasting for her family. That dream, she now understood, had been based on assumptions about loyalty and respect that no longer existed. Behind her, the room had settled into an uncomfortable tableau of anxiety and calculation. Bradley paced near the fireplace with the restless energy of someone who knew he was about to face consequences, but couldn't predict their scope. Stephanie sat rigidly on the leather sofa, her perfectly styled appearance at odds with the growing panic in her eyes. The children had been sent to play in the backyard, sparing them from whatever revelations were about to reshape their family's future. Caroline had positioned herself near her mother, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes about the fractures that had developed along generational lines. Margaret remained in her corner chair, clearly hoping to avoid being drawn into whatever storm was brewing. Janet Reeves had attempted to leave twice, only to be politely but firmly asked to stay by Victoria, who apparently wanted all the conspirators present for what was coming. The sound of a car in the driveway broke the tense silence. Victoria watched through the window as David Morrison stepped out of his silver Lexus, moving with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades handling complex legal crises. At 68, David possessed the kind of distinguished presence that came from years of courtroom victories and boardroom negotiations. His relationship with Victoria had developed slowly, built on mutual respect for each other's professional accomplishments and genuine enjoyment of each other's company. The doorbell rang, and Victoria moved to answer it herself, a small gesture that nonetheless reinforced her authority in a house where she had been locked out just hours earlier. "David," she said, accepting his embrace and feeling the solid comfort of someone who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. "Victoria, my dear," David replied, studying her face with the perceptive attention of someone who had learned to read her moods over their months together. "You look like someone who's been through a battle." "Several battles, actually," Victoria replied, "but I think I'm finally ready to win the war." As they entered the living room together, Victoria noted the way her family members' expressions shifted at David's arrival. Here was the man they had demonized, the supposed threat to their financial security, the outside influence they claimed was compromising Victoria's judgment. In reality, David Morrison was a distinguished attorney whose presence represented everything they feared most: Victoria's independence and her right to seek happiness on her own terms. "David, you know most everyone here," Victoria said, gesturing around the room, "though I suspect some people have been discussing you more than they've been talking to you." David's slight smile suggested he understood exactly what kind of discussions had been taking place. "I'm sure my presence in Victoria's life has raised questions. That's natural when family dynamics change." "Questions? Yes," Victoria replied, "but also some rather extraordinary actions that I think you should be aware of." She moved to the center of the room, positioning herself so she could address everyone present while maintaining eye contact with each person. The authority she had developed through decades of business leadership was evident in her posture and bearing. "David, it seems that my relationship with you has been perceived as such a threat to family stability that extraordinary measures have been deemed necessary," Victoria began, her voice carrying the precision of someone delivering a prepared statement. "Those measures have included secret consultations with competing law firms, research into competency evaluation procedures, and coordination of today's birthday party exclusion as a demonstration of changed power dynamics." David's expression shifted from mild curiosity to sharp attention as the implications of what Victoria was describing became clear. As an attorney who specialized in estate planning and family business transitions, he was familiar with the tactics used by family members seeking to gain control of assets through manipulation and legal maneuvering. "Are you telling me that your family has been researching how to challenge your competency?" David asked, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who understood exactly what such actions entailed. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Victoria confirmed. "Along with constructing narratives about your supposed influence over my decision-making and your alleged financial motivations for our relationship." David turned to look at Bradley and Stephanie, his expression shifting into the analytical mode that had made him formidable in courtroom confrontations. "May I ask what specifically concerns you about my relationship with Victoria? Have I done something to suggest I'm acting against her interests or your family's well-being?" The direct question forced Bradley to confront the disconnect between his accusations and observable reality. David Morrison had been nothing but professional and respectful in his interactions with the family, and his legal advice had consistently favored structures that protected everyone's interests. "It's not about your behavior specifically," Bradley said uncomfortably. It's about the potential for conflicts of interest when personal and professional relationships overlap. I see, David replied with the calm precision of someone dismantling a weak argument. And in your view, my 40 years of professional legal practice and established ethical standards are somehow insufficient protection against these theoretical conflicts of interest. We're not questioning your professional integrity, Stephanie interjected, though her voice lacked conviction. We're concerned about how romantic feelings might influence business advice. David's slight smile carried no warmth. Mrs. Sterling, romantic feelings have been influencing business advice since the beginning of commerce. The difference is whether those feelings lead to better protection of the client's interests or worse. In Victoria's case, my personal investment in her well-being has made me more thorough, more careful, and more protective of her interests than I might be with a purely professional client. But it could also make you more willing to advise changes that benefit you personally, Bradley persisted. Such as? David asked directly. Can you point to a single piece of advice I've given Victoria that benefits me at the expense of her family's interests? The challenge hung in the air. Unanswered, because no such advice existed. David's recommendations had consistently focused on strengthening the succession plan, protecting the family's tax position, and ensuring smooth transitions that would benefit everyone involved. Victoria watched this exchange with growing appreciation for David's professional skill and personal integrity. The man her family had demonized was calmly demonstrating exactly why their concerns were baseless, while exposing the logical flaws in their accusations. Actually, Victoria said, drawing everyone's attention back to her, David's advice has been so consistently protective of the family's interests that I've sometimes wondered if he was being too generous to people who were actively working against me. The statement sent a visible chill through the room. Victoria was suggesting that David's advice had actually favored her family more than it had favored her own interests. What do you mean? Caroline asked. Victoria moved to the sideboard where she had placed her purse and withdrew a folder of documents. I mean that, while Bradley and Stephanie were secretly consulting with competitors and researching competency evaluations, David was working to structure the business transition in ways that would maximize their benefits, even at some cost. To my own financial position, she handed the folder to David, who scanned the contents with professional efficiency. His expression grew increasingly grim as he reviewed the documents. Victoria, some of these recommendations are actually disadvantageous to your long-term financial security, David said. The accelerated timeline for ownership transfer, the immediate vesting of certain benefits, the limited retention of oversight authority. These terms are far more generous to Bradley than standard succession planning would recommend. I know, Victoria replied. I approved them because I wanted to demonstrate good faith and family commitment. I wanted Bradley to feel secure and trusted as he assumed leadership responsibilities. But based on what you've told me about their recent activities, David continued, that good faith wasn't reciprocated. Instead, your generosity was interpreted as evidence of compromised judgment that justified further manipulation. The clinical assessment cut through the emotional complexity of the situation to its essential unfairness. Victoria had been operating from generosity and trust, while her son and daughter-in-law had been operating from suspicion and greed. Bradley's face had gone pale as the implications of David's analysis became clear. Mom, we didn't know about those provisions. We didn't realize you were structuring things to benefit us. Of course you didn't know, Victoria replied, because you were too busy plotting behind my back to ask direct questions about the succession planning. You assumed the worst about my motivations while I was actually sacrificing my own interests to benefit yours. Stephanie stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking under the weight of the revelations. This isn't fair. We were protecting our children's future. We were trying to ensure stability for the next generation. By destroying the current generation? Victoria asked. Stephanie, you researched how to have me declared incompetent. You planned to take away my autonomy, my dignity, my right to make decisions about my own life. How exactly does that create stability for anyone? We never intended to actually pursue competency evaluation, Stephanie protested. We were just exploring all options. David's professional experience with family manipulation was evident in his response. Mrs. Sterling, in my 40 years of practice, I've seen many families explore competency challenges. The research phase is inevitably followed by implementation, unless the underlying power dynamics change dramatically. You weren't exploring options, you were preparing for warfare. The brutal honesty of his assessment silenced Stephanie's protests. Victoria could see in her daughter-in-law's face the recognition that their schemes had been professionally evaluated and found to be exactly what they appeared: calculated attacks on an elderly woman's autonomy. David, Victoria said, I think it's time for those announcements I mentioned. David nodded, reaching into his briefcase to withdraw additional documents. Victoria asked me to prepare several legal instruments based on the changing circumstances of her family relationships. These documents reflect her current assessment of how to best protect her interests and ensure appropriate distribution of her assets. The formal language carried ominous implications for everyone in the room. Victoria was about to announce changes that would fundamentally alter the financial expectations that had motivated the entire conspiracy against her. First, Victoria began, effective immediately, the succession timeline for Sterling Logistics will be suspended pending a comprehensive review of leadership qualifications and family dynamics. The announcement hit Bradley like a physical blow. The carefully planned transition that had been scheduled to accelerate his assumption of control was now indefinitely postponed. Mom, you can't do that, Bradley protested. The business needs continuity. The clients expect smooth leadership transition. The business needs leadership that can be trusted, Victoria replied firmly. Bradley, you've demonstrated that you're willing to work against my interests while pretending to support them. That's not the kind of judgment I want leading Sterling Logistics. But I've been learning the business for years, Bradley said desperately. I've built relationships with key clients. I've sacrificed other opportunities to prepare for this role. And I've sacrificed 40 years to build something for you to inherit, Victoria replied. The difference is that my sacrifices were made in good faith, while your preparations apparently included researching how to destroy me if I became inconvenient. Caroline, who had been listening to this exchange with a growing understanding of the magnitude of what was happening, stepped forward. Mom, what does this mean for Bradley's future with the company? Victoria looked at her daughter, then at her son, seeing in their faces the recognition that everything they had assumed about their inheritance was now in question. It means, Victoria said, that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt through actions rather than words. Bradley's future with Sterling Logistics will depend on his ability to demonstrate that he values family relationships more than financial gain. How? Bradley asked, his voice barely above a whisper. By accepting that my personal life is not subject to your approval. By acknowledging that your mother's happiness matters as much as your inheritance expectations. By understanding that 70-year-old women are not too old or too emotional to make rational decisions about their own lives. Victoria moved to stand beside David, their partnership evident in the synchronized way they faced the room together. I'm also announcing, Victoria continued, that David and I are planning to marry next spring. The revelation struck the room like lightning. Stephanie actually gasped audibly, while Bradley's face went through a series of expressions that reflected the collapse of all his carefully constructed scenarios. Finally, Victoria said, I'm establishing a new charitable foundation focused on supporting programs for elderly abuse prevention and legal advocacy for seniors facing family manipulation. The foundation will be funded through a significant portion of my estate, ensuring that other families don't have to endure what I've experienced today. The implications were clear. The inheritance expectations that had motivated the conspiracy against Victoria would be dramatically reduced by her charitable giving. Janet Reeves, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of the consequences became clear, finally spoke up. Victoria, perhaps you're making these decisions while you're still emotional about today's events. Maybe it would be wise to wait before making such significant changes. Victoria turned to look at Janet with the kind of smile that had intimidated business competitors for decades. Janet, Thank you for that perfect example of exactly the kind of condescending attitude that convinced me these changes are necessary. The suggestion that my decisions are invalid because I'm emotional is precisely the thinking that led to today's attempted manipulation. David stepped forward, his professional authority evident in the way he addressed the room. I want to be very clear about something. Victoria's decisions today are being made with complete mental clarity and full understanding of their implications. Any future attempts to challenge her competency will be met with vigorous legal defense and potential counterclaims for elder abuse and conspiracy. The warning was delivered with the calm precision of someone who had successfully defended similar cases in court. The family members who had been researching how to attack Victoria's competency now understood that such attacks would result in their own legal jeopardy. Marcus appeared in the doorway from the backyard, his 15-year-old face reflecting confusion about the tension he could sense in the room. "Grandma Victoria, are you okay?" "Emma thinks you're upset about something." Victoria looked at her grandson, seeing in his face the innocence that had been manipulated by adult greed and calculation. These children deserved better than parents who would sacrifice family relationships for financial gain. "Marcus, I'm better than okay," Victoria said, moving to embrace her grandson. "I'm free. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions to protect what's important, and that's what I've done today." "Are you still going to be our grandmother?" Tyler asked, appearing beside his brother with 8-year-old Emma close behind. "Always," Victoria assured them. "Nothing will ever change how much I love you, but things will be different with your parents, because they need to learn some important lessons about respect and family loyalty." As the children gathered around their grandmother, Victoria felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The birthday that had begun with betrayal and manipulation was ending with clarity and empowerment. At 70 years old, she had reclaimed not just her autonomy, but her identity as a woman worthy of respect and capable of making her own choices. The family members who had locked her out of her own celebration had succeeded only in locking themselves out of the future they had tried so desperately to control. Victoria Sterling, the woman they had underestimated, had just demonstrated exactly why she had built an empire from nothing, and why she remained formidable enough to protect it from anyone who threatened her dignity or autonomy. The desert sunset beyond the windows was fading into darkness, but for Victoria, this birthday marked not an ending but a beginning, the start of a life finally lived entirely on her own terms. 6 months later, Victoria stood in the penthouse conference room of Sterling Tower, looking out over the Reno skyline as snow dusted the Sierra Nevada peaks in the distance. The morning board meeting had just concluded with unanimous approval of the company's most profitable quarter in its 40-year history. Under her continued leadership, Sterling Logistics had not only maintained its market position, but had expanded into new territories and secured several major contracts that would ensure prosperity for years to come. The irony was not lost on her that the company Bradley had been so eager to inherit was performing better than ever under the leadership he had tried to undermine. The succession plan remained suspended, not out of vindictiveness, but out of practical necessity. Trust, Victoria had learned, was not just an emotional luxury but a business essential. Her assistant knocked on the conference room door. "Mrs. Sterling, your attorney is here for the foundation meeting." Victoria smiled, adjusting the elegant pearl necklace that David had given her for Christmas. The Sterling Foundation for Elder Rights had officially launched 3 months earlier with an initial endowment of $50 million. Already, they had funded legal advocacy programs in 12 states and were developing educational resources to help families recognize and prevent elder manipulation. David entered the conference room, carrying a folder thick with updates from their various initiatives. At 68, he moved with the same confident bearing that had first attracted Victoria's attention, but now there was an additional warmth in his eyes that spoke of genuine partnership and shared purpose. "Good morning, my dear," he said, kissing her cheek with the comfortable affection of a couple who had weathered storms together. "The Foundation's legal team has some remarkable statistics to share with you." They settled into the comfortable leather chairs that had witnessed decades of business decisions. Victoria poured coffee from the service her assistant had prepared, noting how natural it felt to share these moments of professional collaboration with someone who understood both her business acumen and her personal values. "Tell me about the statistics," Victoria said, opening her tablet to review the Foundation's quarterly report. "In the past 3 months alone, our legal advocacy hotline has received over 800 calls from seniors facing family manipulation or financial abuse," David reported. "We've been able to provide direct legal assistance in 230 cases, and we've prevented at least 15 competency challenges that appeared to be motivated by inheritance disputes rather than genuine concern for mental capacity." Victoria felt a deep satisfaction in these numbers. Each case represented a family crisis potentially avoided, an elderly person's dignity preserved, a manipulation scheme thwarted. The pain of her own birthday betrayal had been transformed into protection for others facing similar threats. "What about the education programs?" Victoria asked. "Even more successful than we expected, the workshop series on recognizing elder manipulation has been requested by senior centers in 38 states. We're scheduling additional sessions as quickly as we can train facilitators." Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen and saw Caroline's name. "Mom, Marcus has been selected for the Stanford pre-med program. He says he wants to specialize in geriatrics because of everything he learned from watching you stand up for yourself. We're all so proud of both of you." The message brought tears to Victoria's eyes. Her grandson, now 16 and preparing for college, had drawn inspiration from her struggle for autonomy. The painful family crisis had become a teaching moment about dignity, respect, and the importance of standing up for one's principles. "Good news?" David asked, noticing her emotional response. "The best kind," Victoria replied, showing him Caroline's message. "Marcus wants to become a geriatrician because of what he witnessed last year." David's smile reflected his own deep satisfaction with how their story was continuing to unfold. "Your grandchildren learned something valuable that day about courage and self-respect. Those lessons will serve them well throughout their lives." Victoria's thoughts turned to her other grandchildren. Tyler, now 13, had become passionate about social justice issues and frequently asked sophisticated questions about fairness and family dynamics. Emma, at 9, displayed an emotional intelligence that suggested she would grow up with a strong sense of personal boundaries and self-worth. "Any word from Bradley lately?" David asked gently. Victoria sighed, looking out at the cityscape that represented so much of her life's work. Caroline mentioned that he and Stephanie are in intensive counseling both individually and as a couple. Apparently, the suspension of the succession plan forced them to confront some fundamental issues about their relationship dynamics and value system. The past 6 months had been a period of reckoning for her son and daughter-in-law. Without the expectation of inheriting Sterling Logistics, Bradley had been forced to develop his own career path and financial independence. The process had apparently been humbling but ultimately beneficial for his personal growth. Stephanie has been working with a therapist who specializes in family manipulation and control issues. Victoria continued. According to Caroline, she's beginning to understand how her own childhood experiences with financial insecurity influenced her behavior toward me. Victoria felt no satisfaction in her daughter-in-law's struggles, but she did feel hope that genuine change might be possible. The suspension of succession planning had been designed not as punishment, but as a cooling-off period that would allow everyone to reassess their priorities and relationship. "And Bradley's business ventures?" David inquired. "Actually thriving," Victoria admitted with genuine pride. Without the expectation of inheriting a ready-made empire, he's been forced to develop his own entrepreneurial skills. His consulting firm has landed several major contracts, and he's building something authentic rather than just waiting for something to be handed to him. The transformation in her son's professional life had been remarkable. Stripped of the assumption that he would inherit Sterling Logistics, Bradley had discovered reserves of creativity and determination that had been dormant while he focused on positioning himself as heir apparent. Victoria's desk phone rang with a call from her secretary. "Mrs. Sterling, there's a young woman here who says she has an appointment about the Foundation's mentorship program." "Send her up, please," Victoria replied. The mentorship program was one of her favorite initiatives, pairing successful older women with younger professionals who were navigating complex family business dynamics. Elena Martinez entered the conference room with the confident bearing of someone who had overcome significant challenges to achieve professional success. At 35, she was the CEO of a family-owned construction company in Las Vegas, but her rise to leadership had been complicated by relatives who questioned whether a young woman could effectively manage a traditionally male-dominated business. "Mrs. Sterling, Mr. Morrison, thank you so much for meeting with me," Elena said, shaking hands with both of them. "The Foundation's support has been invaluable in helping me navigate the legal and family challenges I've been facing." Victoria gestured for Elena to take a seat, remembering her own struggles as a young widow trying to establish credibility in the business world. "Tell us about your recent experiences with the mentorship program. The legal resources you provided helped me restructure our company's governance to protect against future manipulation attempts," Elena explained. "But more importantly, the emotional support from the mentor network gave me the confidence to stand up for myself when family members tried to undermine my authority." These success stories were what made Victoria's charitable work so meaningful. Every young woman who learned to recognize and resist manipulation, every elderly person who maintained their autonomy, every family that learned healthier dynamics, all of it justified the painful process of transformation that had begun on her 70th birthday. "What's next for your company?" David asked. "We've just been awarded a major infrastructure contract that will double our revenue over the next 3 years." Elena replied with obvious pride. "The family members who questioned my competence are now very interested in being more supportive of my leadership." Victoria laughed, recognizing the familiar pattern of family dynamics changing when financial success became undeniable. "Funny how competence becomes more apparent when the bank account grows." "Exactly," Elena agreed, "but the Foundation's training helped me establish boundaries that will prevent future problems. I know now how to protect my authority while maintaining family relationships." After Elena left, Victoria and David spent another hour reviewing Foundation business and planning initiatives for the coming year. The work was demanding but fulfilling, providing a sense of purpose that made Victoria grateful for the painful awakening that had led to this new chapter of her life. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Victoria's phone rang with a call that surprised her. Bradley's name appeared on the screen. "Hello, Bradley," she answered, her voice carefully neutral. "Mom, I hope I'm not interrupting your work," Bradley said, his tone carrying a humility that had been absent for years. "I wanted to ask if you and David might be free for dinner this weekend. Stephanie and I have been doing a lot of thinking, and we'd like to have an honest conversation about everything that happened." Victoria exchanged glances with David, who nodded encouragingly. "What kind of conversation, Bradley?" "The kind where I acknowledge how wrong I was and ask if there's any possibility of rebuilding trust between us," Bradley replied. "I've learned a lot about myself over the past 6 months, and I want to share that with you if you're willing to listen." Victoria felt a cautious optimism stirring in her chest. The son who had tried to manipulate and control her was apparently ready to engage in genuine accountability and relationship repair. "Bradley, I'd be willing to have that conversation under certain conditions," Victoria said. "Complete honesty about what happened, acknowledgement of the harm that was caused, and clear commitments about how things would be different going forward." "I accept those conditions completely," Bradley replied without hesitation. "Mom, I know I have a lot to make up for, and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to earn back your trust." After ending the call, Victoria sat quietly for a moment, processing the emotional complexity of potentially reconciling with the son who had betrayed her so profoundly. "How do you feel about that?" David asked gently. "Hopeful but cautious," Victoria replied honestly. "I've learned that trust must be rebuilt through consistent actions over time, not just through words and promises." "That's wisdom born from experience," David agreed. "And you have the luxury of taking as much time as you need to evaluate whether the changes are genuine." Victoria gathered her materials and prepared to leave the office where she had made so many important decisions over the decades. The view from these windows had watched her transform from a struggling young widow into a successful businesswoman, and now into an advocate for others facing similar challenges. "David," she said as they walked toward the elevator, Do you ever regret getting involved with such a complicated family situation? David stopped and turned to face her, his expression serious but warm. Victoria, loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life. Yes, your family situation was complicated, but watching you handle it with such grace and strength only made me admire you more. As they descended toward the parking garage, Victoria reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that painful birthday, 18 months ago. The woman who had been locked out of her own celebration had not only reclaimed her autonomy, but had used her experience to help countless others facing similar challenges. The Sterling Foundation's work was expanding rapidly, with plans for a national conference on elder rights and family manipulation prevention scheduled for the following year. Victoria's story had become a case study in several law schools' elder law programs, helping to train the next generation of attorneys who would advocate for seniors facing family manipulation. That evening, as Victoria and David sat on the terrace of her penthouse apartment, overlooking the lights of Reno, she felt a profound sense of completion. The city spread out below them, represented not just her business success, but her journey toward understanding her own worth independent of other people's expectations or approval. "A penny for your thoughts," David said, refilling their wine glasses with the excellent vintage they had selected together during a recent trip to Napa Valley. "I was thinking about how different this view looks now compared to a year ago," Victoria replied. "The same city, the same mountains, but everything feels transformed because I'm seeing it through different eyes." "The eyes of a woman who refuses to accept less than she deserves," David observed. "Exactly. It took me 70 years to fully understand that lesson, but I'm grateful I learned it while I still had time to apply it." Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Emma, now 10 years old and more articulate than ever. "Grandma Victoria, I wrote a story for school about brave grandmothers who stand up for themselves. My teacher wants to know if you would come talk to our class about women's rights. Will you come?" The invitation brought a smile to Victoria's face. Her youngest granddaughter was already internalizing lessons about personal strength and self-advocacy. The painful family crisis that had begun with betrayal was continuing to yield positive outcomes for the next generation. "I think," Victoria said, showing David the message, "that this story is far from over. In fact, it feels like it's just beginning." As the desert stars emerged in the Nevada sky above them, Victoria Sterling, businesswoman, philanthropist, survivor and advocate, looked forward to whatever adventures the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that she would face them on her own terms, with dignity intact and purpose clear. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.